Limbo Lodge by Joan Aiken, Chapter 9. There was a horrified silence for a number of minutes after Manuel and Mateo had left the cave. Then Tylo whispered, "Us go more back, Farin." They did so, until they had gone what Tylo considered a safe distance along the windings of the passage. He blew on a piece of fire fungus which gave off a glow not much brighter than that of the glowworms, but was sufficient to show them each other's shocked faces.
"That Manuel!" breathed Dido. "That Manuel is a real hellion. Fancy murdering that poor old fellow, that Zamora, just because he wouldn't set a fire for them."
"Zamora," said Tylo mournfully. "Zamora, my father's cousin's aunt tree-uncle. Very wise man, very tree old." Herod's foot came out of his long silence. He said, "Am I right in thinking they killed that man? I was never so shocked, never so scandalized. It was the most monstrous thing. If there were a British resident on this island, I would record the strongest possible protest. I would demand proper retribution."
"But there ain't a British what's-its-name," Dido pointed out. "So any retribution we got to do ourselves, though I don't quite see how."
"What is that wretched man up to?" demanded Herod's foot. "What is his aim?"
Why did they want somebody to marry Doc Tally?" Dido wanted to know.
"Is that who they mean when they say Ermala? Why do they call her that?" "Forest name for her," explained Tylo. "When she born, nursewoman in King's house, Asgard, her ma die when she born, but Nurse Kaniki call her Ermala." "How do you know that? Aunt Tala tell me?" "Aunt Tala seems to know everything. But a lot of names Tally's got. Jane, Talisman, Ermala." Herod's foot heaved a great sigh.
"Poor Frankie," Dido thought.
She did not say it aloud. It was a bit hard on him, though, she thought, hearing that scaly Manuel say all those nasty things about him, that he was a no account, a trifling fellow, a poor thing.
And it ain't true besides. Frankie's a bit slow and a mite careless with his glasses, but he's as decent a fellow as ever walked down the pike."
"What is Manuel up to now?" Herod's foot asked. "He want to push out his brother, Sovereign John. He got town guard camped up by bridge, ready to attack Limbo Lodge."
"His own brother? No, I remember," muttered Herod's foot, mostly to himself. "In Bad Somsburg. I remember there was some scandal attached to Manuel Roy. After cheating at cards, he had waylaid a person who threatened to expose him and stabbed the man, but nothing was proved. Why doesn't his brother stop him if he has his own guards over there in the palace?" Tylo pondered. "Sovereign John maybe not know, and we forest folk not like fight," he presently offered. "But John ain't a forest person. He came from Norfolk," Dido said.
He old now. He learned forest notions."
"That's true, and he had them from his wife too, didn't he? But do you reckon he really doesn't know what Manuel is up to?"
"Golly, maybe," said Tylo doubtfully. "Or maybe he hopes still whispering leaves, sand voices, knotting grass blow across Manuel's path, trip him." He had lost Dido. She did not understand the references.
"What we got to do, Tylo?" she said. "We can't go and call on King John if his brother Manuel is camped in front of the bridge with his guards. There's no other way across the gorge. We're in a bit of a fix. And from what Manuel said to that other cove, he plans to do us all in. Who was the other guy, the one Manuel called Mateo? Is he kin to those folks where we stayed?"
"He that gal's brother."
"But he said his sister had gone off to the cliff of death."
"Hush," replied Tylo. "Listen." Far back in the cave, where they now were, the silence was very complete. The massive rock above and around them seemed to banish all noise, save an occasional faint drip of water. No, not quite all noise. Tiny, in the distance, far, far away, came the smallest possible cry, not more than the thinnest spider-web of sound.
"Where's it coming from?" breathed Dido.
"Maybe from front ways, inside cave. You stay here, Shocky Dido," said Tylo softly. "Stay here with my lord Oklosh. I go look.
"Suppose you don't come back."
I come, you see. If I no come, you go back to horses. Go back to my Sisigana.
Could I ever find the way?
I think you find it, Shucky Dido. You got good Barat.
Tylo told her encouragingly. Dido did not know exactly what Barat was. Common sense, maybe, but his tone cheered her. Tylo, Tylo broke off a morsel of fire fungus, passed it to her, and slipped off along the passage.
Where's the boy gone? Asked Herodsfoot after a while.
There was a noise. Sounded like a baby crying.
A baby? In this place? Who in the world? Oh, dear me, sighed Herodsfoot.
I feel so useless. If only Talisman were here. How happy we should be to see her. You never said a truer word, Frankie, thought Dido. Then she thought she caught the sound of soft pattering footsteps. In a moment she was sure of it. Tylo was returning. He came rather slowly. Dido was puzzled momentarily, as he seemed to have balanced the fire fungus on his head on a flat flake of stone, while he carried a bundle in his arms. It was too dark to see what he held, until he came up to Dido and passed her the bundle, which felt like an outsized grass bird's nest, with something warm and solid in the middle. As Tylo handed the bundle to Dido, it let out a faint chirrup and waved a fist.
Save us, a baby!
Paper tell who, said Tylo. Having handed Dido the baby, he removed the fire fungus from his head and pulled a folded paper from his waistband. Holding the fungus beside the paper, he raised it near enough to Dido's face, so she was able to read the few lines written on it.
I have gone to jump off the cliff of death and rejoin my beloved Cowbray, who was killed by my brother and father. I will not take my baby, for if the tree fathers of Eritu wish her to live, she will be found and cared for. Whoever finds this paper, please, if she is still living, take my baby to a tree mother. Louisa Eria.
What a shame, thought Dido. Doc Talisman goes to all the trouble of keeping that gal from dying, helping her baby be born, and then she has to go and jump off the cliff of death. Now what's to be done?
Where's the nearest tree mother?
She murmured to Dido. He seemed a bit nonplussed.
Best we go down to Horse Cave. Yeah, that would be farther away from those coves and their camp, in case the baby lets out a yip and they hear her. And you got some Dagila juice in one of the saddlebags, haven't you? Maybe she'd take a drop of that.
So they moved with the utmost care and caution, out of the cave and back down the cliff path. The mist was still very thick, the night still black dark, and the going down the narrow, slippery, twisting path very slow and unpleasant, and often very terrifying. Dido, holding the bundle of baby, was glad that Tylo walked ahead of her, sometimes reaching back a friendly hand to steady her on the sharper turns. Herodsfoot came behind Dido, every now and then letting out little subdued grunts of anxiety. Dido could sense, as if by telepathy, each time he felt an impulse to take off his glasses and wipe them.
Don't take those glasses off, Frankie. Wiping them won't make a mite of difference in this tarnal fog.
So far the plaster the Talisman had wrapped around the earpiece had held firm, but it was becoming very grubby and frayed. They could tell when they drew near the lower cave because of the warm smell of horse that came drifting up the cliff path. Stepping slowly down, carrying the grass-wrapped baby, who was quite heavy, she must weigh as much as a Michaelmas goose. Dido became possessed by an unreasonable fear. Suppose those massive crocodiles had decided to clamber all the way up the cliff path and devour the horses. But when they reached the lower cave, all seemed orderly and quiet, the horses peaceably munching on their fodder, and no rapacious reptiles to be seen. The baby was so tranquil and well-behaved that Dido wondered if her mother had given her a dose of some calming herb juice to quiet her when they escaped from the Quinquillo ranch. But when offered a sip of Dagila juice, she sucked it willingly enough, then went back to sleep in her cocoon of grass and leaves.
What'll us do now?
Dido whispered to Tylo, and he whispered back, Wait till day come. This seemed a sensible plan, as they were all exhausted after the day's trek through the forest, and parting from Talisman at the cliff foot, and the long struggle up and down the cliff path. They piled themselves beds of keto grass and opie vine apawi vine, sprinkled candu nuts, and gratefully lay down to sleep. Outside, they could hear the distant roar of the Kai River, far below still, and sometimes the cry of a night bird. It should have been easy to sink into slumber, but Dido lay wakeful and worried. We are in a right dicey pickle, she thought, with those Angrian coves up above are planning to do in old John King, and Doc Tally Lord knows where, and Cap Sanderson laid up with snakebite in that crazy fellow's hut, and the Sawara loaded with pearls on the way to Valparaiso, leaving us marooned in Aratu. I reckon Captain Hughes back on the Thrush will be wondering where the devil we got to. And poor old Multiple in that creepy hospital being cared for by a parcel of witches, all because we came hunting for Frankie Herodsfoot and his precious games. Those games just better cure old King Jamie of his megrims. If we ever do get back to London after all. At last she slept, and woke to a thin silver blade of sunlight slicing in from the cave's upper left-hand corner, piercing between the bulbous stalactites and Yorka's small, hard hands, urgently tugging her awake. Yorka! Shucky Dido! You wake quick, I bring news and breakfast. We got news too, said Dido. We found a baby. Oh! Yorka exclaimed mournfully as Dido told the baby's history. Well, that poor outrust girl, she now with her Cobry in Underforest, better than stay in dark, cold, unkind house. But we best take the baby to Aunt Tala pretty quick. Where is Aunt Tala? Breakfast first, we feed baby. Then, now I find out. Yorka had brought tickle fruit, which had firm, juicy pink flesh under a thin, brittle rind. The baby accepted some of its juice, trickled into her mouth, then slept again. Yorka showed Dido how to wrap her snugly in one of the huge green yucca leaves. What about Cap Sanderson? Where did you leave him? Asked Dido. Yorka said she had fetched back the guide, Trinky, who had taken care of Sanderson before when he was making for Manatee Harbor. Take him back to Regina Town. Snakebite better, Ruiz still sleep. I thought Trinky's father was dying. Father die, go to Underforest. Trinky glad come back. I just hope Sanderson won't get into trouble in Regina Town. He was so angry about his ship. Herodsfoot, who had been munching tickle fruit, in gloomy silence, it seemed as if, on top of everything else, he was suffering from a homesick longing for bacon, eggs, toast, and marmalade, now said, And what are we proposing to do? First, find Aunt Tala, said Yorka. Dido had been wondering how Yorka had been able to summon Trinky to conduct Captain Sanderson back to the town. Now she watched with interest as Yorka stepped outside the cave, climbed a short way up the sloping cliff face to a knob of rock, and stood on this, tilting her head as far back as it would go. She looked as if she were staring intently at the sky, but her eyes were shut, so she stood absolutely still for about 5 minutes. Once Herodsfoot began to say something, but Tylo hushed him with a gesture. Dido, listening intently, caught the faint sound of drums in the far distance. Also, more disquieting and closer at hand, a sharp crackle now and then, which might be rifle fire. Now Yorka came down from her rock. Aunt Tala not far, on Mount Fura. But that's where Limbo Lodge is, ain't it? Said Dido. Across the gorge? Tylo said, Maybe Aunt Tala go visit old Sovereign John. Be golly good she do that. But what do we do? Is there a bridge? Can we get across? I go see, said Tylo. You all wait here. And he flitted away up the steep cliff path. I hope he'll be careful, said Dido anxiously. Seems to me I heard gunfire up there. Higo Taku, said Yorka. Then Yorka related an item of news which she had been politely withholding until the party's plans had been discussed. While at the foot of the cliff path, by the crocodile beach, she had seen a strange sight. A large number of men, 5 times fingers and toes, climbed quite easily, it seemed, down the cliff of death, like some person before made footplaces in the rock. Stairs, said Dido. Steps, like when we went to bed in the area house, high up in the tower. Yes, stairs, path on cliff. Men coming down. Many Outros men. That's mighty queer. Do you think John King was one of them, escaping from Limbo Lodge by the back door? Old Sovereign King, much old climb cliff, said Yorka firmly. What did the men do when they got to the bottom? How did they get past all those crocodiles? They had dropped rafts into the sea, Yorka said, big light rafts made of sliced up clovewood. They climbed down to the rafts, floated away up the west side of the island. Where will they get to? Regina Town? Yorka explained that every few months, when the volcano south of the island was due to erupt, a war motion current set in, flowing northwards, which would, in about 3 days, carry the rafts directly to the north tip of the island. Do you think they were going for help to fight Manuel? Yorka thought this unlikely. Who would help? The forest people? But the forest people would never fight, Yorka said. Their task was to sing and listen and heal. What useful result did fighting ever produce? Now Tylo came back. His report was discouraging. Manuel Roy, with a large troop of Angrian town guard, was encamped on the brink of a gorge by the bridge over the Kai Ravine. The bridge could not be crossed. Guards with muskets patrolled it every few minutes, and the troop, from time to time, fired their muskets into the forest, which surrounded Limbo Lodge. Maybe Manuel plans to starve the king out, said Herodsfoot. What a way to use your own brother, disgraceful. When I return to London, I shall tell His Majesty King James that we must immediately cancel our treaty of trade and defence with Aratu. Before that, though, said Dido, how are we going to get to see John King? Had us better climb up those steps in the cliff? She did not sound at all eager. Herodsfoot turned pale at the very suggestion, and both Tylo and Yorka were opposed to it. Cliff of Death, holy place for jumping off, not climbing up. Talisman did. Well, Talisman had her own good reasons, and was special, their silence conveyed. So, what then? Yorka had a plan. It would not be too hard, she said, to make another bridge. They would do it farther down the gorge, around several bends, where Manuel and his men could not see what they were up to. But the gorge is wider down there, and how in the world, may I ask, can you build a bridge? But the gorge is wider down there, and how in the world, may I ask, can you build a bridge? Asked Herodsfoot in disbelief. He did not sound any happier about the idea than he had at the notion of climbing homemade steps up a 1,000-foot cliff. But Yorka sent Tylo off to the fishing village on the other side of the headland with a gift of some jejila pods, which she had by her, and a request for shark rope. What is sharp rope, Yorka? Rope made from human hair, very strong, easy catch shark. While Tylo was gone, Yorka strolled down the cliff path, looking across the gorge, until she found what she considered a suitable place for a bridge, and she set Dido to collecting spider webs. These were plentiful, all up and down the cliff path, spread over the thorny, healthier shrubs which grew on the tip of the cliff and at the edge of the trees. The large, gray, black, and yellow spiders who spun the webs were not at all pleased at having their handiwork taken away, and shook their legs furiously at Dido, who did not greatly care for the task of despoiling them. Will they bite me? She asked Yorka, who said, Not if you don't let them. Herodsfoot was of no use at this job, as his short sight prevented him from seeing where the webs were, and he broke the stem of his glasses trying to help. Lucky spider web good for mending glasses, Yorka said, and she did an emergency repair while Dido went on with the web collecting. In the end, they had a substantial heap, which Yorka skillfully twisted into a thin line, only just visible in the sunshine. Then Yorka's memory bird was sent across the gorge at the selected spot with instructions to fly around a chosen tree and come back again with the end of the cord. A thicker strand was now attached and pulled across. At this point, Tylo returned from his trip to the fishing village with 2 huge hanks of human hair cord and a gift of shark steaks. When he saw the slender strands stretched across the ravine, he beamed approval. Golly good, soon now we make bridge. Herodsfoot had been watching these activities with incredulous disapproval. We cross that? Who, pray, will carry the baby, and what about the horses? I fetch Trinky. We take horses back to Regina, said Yorka.
Meanwhile, Dido cooked the shark steaks, and Tylo passed a third strand and a fourth across the width of the gorge. Next, a length of rope was pulled across, and another. Then Tylo went across himself, holding the upper rope, sliding his feet along the lower. Dido found it impossible to watch him. She gulped and had to close her eyes, thinking of the roaring white water forcing its way between rocks so very far down below. But he did it without the least concern, and skipped ashore on the far side to fasten the ropes more securely and clear out a foothold on the top of the cliff. The forest grew right down to the cliff edge on that side, but Yorka had chosen her site well. There were two large, smooth tickle trees, which provided a strong, reliable support for the bridge. By the time the shark steaks were cooked, Tylo and Yorka had constructed a trustworthy-looking rope bridge with 2 strands of rope on each side, an upper and a lower, and a network of cords zigzagging between, forming a floor or footing. Tylo and Yorka had both been across the gorge several times during the construction of the bridge. Now Yorka said, "You go this time, Dido. Take baby." "Time you go," as if she were conferring a big privilege. And Tylo, returning from a scouting trip up the cliff path, said, "Best us all go pretty gully quick. Outros gods coming down path for lookabout." With a lump in her gullet the size of a cricket ball, Dido picked up the baby and moved toward the bridge. "No, no, baby on back," said Yorka, and with a swift whipping of Oppo vine, fastened the bundle of baby and ucka leaf onto Dido's shoulders. "Now you got 2 hand for hold." Dido found it best not to look at the foamy water crashing and thundering among the rocks such a long way below, those frail-seeming strands of rope that supported her feet. She kept her eyes steadily fixed straight ahead on the dark tree-covered slope in front and tried to ignore sounds from behind. The rattle of musket fire, and then, more ominously, men's shouts from higher up on the hill on her right. She knew the bridge was not strong enough to support more than one person at a time. She tried to accelerate her pace, but it made the rope structure swing about in a terrifying way, and she dared not go any faster. "Come along, Shucky Dido, you do good," shouted Tylo encouragingly from the far bank. She plunged on desperately. The baby woke and let out a thin wail. Muskets cracked from the hillside behind her right shoulder, and she saw a chip fly off one of the tickle trunks. Then Tylo's hand was grasping hers, pulling her up on the cliff's edge. "Good. Now you Shucky Dido lie down behind tree," urged Tylo, and she was glad to do so, but could not help peering out to see Yorka, nimble as a string monkey, flit across the bridge, hardly more visible than a gust of wind among branches. Last came Herod's foot, and Dido grew sick with fright as she watched his gangling, awkward progress. Now the men with their muskets were not more than 3 or 4 turns of the cliff path from the bushes above Yorka's bridge. Dido could see the flashes and puffs of smoke as they discharged their weapons. It seemed impossible that they should miss him, but luckily their aim was poor, and Herod's foot's own clumsiness stood him in good stead. The bridge swung so wildly that he was never in the same spot for 2 consecutive seconds. But just as Tylo had caught one of his hands to pull him to safety, a bullet did catch him in the shoulder, and he jerked uncontrollably and cried out. "Come, quick, come!" cried Yorka, and grabbed his arm. He was dragged onto the bank and hustled down out of view. Tylo, without wasting a moment, cut through the support cords of the bridge and jerked on a rope which attached it by a slip knot to the opposite side. The whole flimsy structure dropped into the gorge and was gone. "What a shame," said Dido. "After all that trouble to make it. But let's look at poor Frankie. Is he hurt bad?" "Not too bad, I think," gasped Herod's foot, who was being alternately scolded and comforted by Yorka. "Did the bullet lodge in you?" "No, it scraped my collarbone and passed on. I was lucky." "Golly lucky," agreed Tylo. "Come on now. Best we get out of here." With Tylo and Yorka taking an arm apiece, Herod's foot was bundled back among the trees, and Dido followed with the baby as fast as she could. The forest was much thicker here on the north-facing side of the gorge, so that in a very few minutes they were completely masked by trees and could not be seen by musketeers. But still, these men kept up their fire for a long time,
peppering the whole hillside, and sometimes, by pure chance, a shot came dangerously close. Too bad now they know it's us, and that we're here, said Dido. Won't know that long time, said Tylo, and he laid a course diagonally upward through the trees, whistling to his memory bird and listening to its twittered answers. Then, slightly changing direction, all the time edging and twisting his way through close-growing vegetation, lianas, creeper, tree fern, palm bowls, and dapo vine. Not so much spice at this end of the island, Dido noticed. Maybe it's not so hot here. The forest smelt juicy rather than spicy. It was just as well that Tylo and the memory bird between them seemed to know where they were heading, for dusk now fell fast, making the rope bridge had taken up a lot of the day. The marksmen finally gave up their fire, perhaps thinking it was a waste of ammunition, but it was plain that the gorge must be very narrow here, and the edge of it not far off. Dido could sometimes smell campfires and meat cooking, and catch the sound now and then of men's voices. Tylo must be leading his party parallel with the gorge rather than turning south towards King's residence, which Dido recalled as being about halfway up Mount Fura, nestled snugly in a lap of the forest between two spurs of hillside. Where are you taking us, Tylo? She asked when they paused for a rest in a small clearing, where for once it was possible to see the sky above, all clustered with stars. Tylo said, Not good fetch up Sovereign's house in dark night. Guards might shoot at us. Can be so, also, come Sovereign Island. Good first stop ghost house. What is the ghost house, Tylo? Yorka chipped in. How Sovereign John build his wife after she die? Her tomb? Dido did not know the Delindi word for tomb, so she used the English one, but neither Tylo nor Yorka were familiar with the word. Where she was buried? Dido offered instead. Buried? No. Only Angrians buried their dead, Dido learned. The forest people thought this was a disgusting practice. They burned the bodies of their dead relations and then threw them off the cliff of death in clay pots. Dido wondered a little where the skulls had come from that were buried under the monoliths at the place of stones, but was too polite to ask. Perhaps the skulls were from some long earlier time, when habits were different. Ghost house, said Tylo, after about half an hour's climb. They had reached a small clearing which seemed like a hollow in the hillside, perhaps the site of an old quarry. The ground here was flat and seemed mossy underfoot. Dido noticed two things. First, that the place was chilly, which surprised her very much. She could not remember feeling so cold since the thrush had left the Straits of Magellan. Secondly, despite its chill, the air was heavy with the fragrance of spices: musk, aloe, ambergris, pepper, civet, basil. Her nose prickled. She wanted to sneeze. Looking up, she saw through the opening of the trees that a hazy pale moon was floating overhead, half veiled by wisps of cloud. Where does all the scent come from? She whispered to Yorka, who whispered back. Gifts to Ghost House many people bring. Not now, they won't. Not with Manuel's guards losing off their barkers at anybody who steps this way, said Dido. What's the gifts for? Yorka made a vague answer. People sorry King Wifey die, sorry her baby die, hope someday they come back. Tylo said, My lord Oklosh, some poorly. Best stop here. Yorka, you wrap him in cobweb. Poor Herod's foot was indeed weak from pain and loss of blood. It was high time they halted. Dido was surprised that Yorka and Tylo seemed quite prepared to use the ghost house as a night camping site. It was a queer little building, built of pale rock. It was quite visible in the dull moonlight. To Dido it seemed most unpractical. It consisted of 12 pillars, set in a square, approached by steps and standing on a stone platform. A flat roof did not entirely cover the space enclosed by the pillars. A double spiral of steps led up through a large opening in the roof. On the roof could be seen the statue of a woman holding a child. Both woman and child were veiled and only partly visible. Yorka had lowered Herod's foot. onto the steps leading up to the pillars, and was binding up his wound with a handful of cobwebs gathered on the way and strips of ucka leaf. Dido was glad to sit and rest beside them, moving the baby from her shoulder to her lap. "Is that King John's wife? Or is that John King's wife?" she whispered to Tylo, pointing at the statue. He nodded. "The Otros people," he told her, regarded this as a very haunted place and disliked coming here after dark. So although they were not very far now from the bridge and the guards' camp, no one would be coming that way before daylight. "Forest people ain't afraid of ghosts?" inquired Dido. "Not golly likely," Tylo chuckled. Ghosts, after all, were only Auntie Nawa and Uncle Tombrew. Uncle Toburu. What harm could they do? The poor things were only trying to tell you something useful, or feeling a bit lonely not having found their way yet. To the other forest, there was no harm in ghosts, not in the forest, only in the houses were ghosts harmful. "You stay here," Tylo said. "I go find us supper from camp." "Tylo, no, you don't mean you're going to swipe some victuals from the guards?" But that was what he did mean to do. "How will you cross the bridge?" "I go taku, they never see me." "Go under bridge handwise, and hear what they talk about." He slung a leaf bag on his back and slipped away among the trees. There was an old wocho behind the ghost house, in very poor repair. Perhaps it was left over from the time when the little monument had been used to house the builders or their tools. Dido and Yorka decided that it would make a good sleeping place, carried in armfuls of dried moss and creeper to make beds for the party. "This'll be my 5th night in Eritu," thought Dido. "It seems more like 5 months." What makes it so cold just here?" she asked Yorka. Yorka said, "The ghost. John King's wife. Dead wife feel cold till husband come. King wifey feel extra cold. She die of poison." "Croupus," said Dido. "I bet my mum would feel cold if my dad weren't about. I bet my mum wouldn't feel cold if my dad weren't about. She'd be dancing in the street there. That'll be more comfortable for Frankie and the baby than lying on the cold stone floor." Tylo came back from his raid on the camp looking much more serious than when he had set out, despite the fact that he brought a pot of hot stew and a bag of fruit. Manuel had got hold of old Taya's buoy, he said, which was a very bad and worrying thing. "Old Taya's buoy do anything for drink." The forest people hardly ever touched strong drink, wine, or spirits, and small wonder. In order to keep alive and undamaged in the forest, you needed your eyes alert and your wits about you. But Taya's buoy, found orphaned as a baby and brought up by an Angrian schoolteacher, had acquired a passion for palm toddy and would do almost anything for a couple of drinks. "It's a pity he is #1 fire shooter." "What's that?" Tylo explained. If the forest people wanted, as they occasionally did, to burn out a small patch of forest, they first soaked the surrounding area with pails of water. "Or make rain, but not all Kaniki can do that." When the surrounding forest was thoroughly wet, the fire shooter, from a safe distance, shot a flaming arrow into the middle of the section that was to be burned. "Why not just light it with a bit of fire fungus?" "Because," said Tylo, "the forest and the forest earth were so very combustible that the whole patch would explode unless the greatest care was taken. That was why cooking fires were always contained in stone caskets, and why mostly the forest people ate their food raw." "So what's Manuel want with this Taya's buoy?" "Wants him shoot fire arrow onto Mount Fura, burn out John King." "Oh, murder!" said Dido, and Herod's foot, who had been silently listening, exclaimed, "But that is monstrous, a crime of the blackest kind. First, a fire on Mount Fura would mean the death of John King, his household, not to mention ourselves. Not only that, but it would destroy all the animal life on this portion of the island. And if the wind should change and blow northwards over the gorge, the whole island might go up in flames. It is the most wickedly irresponsible plan. It is not to be thought of." "Better be thought of," said Tylo, frowning.
We go early before sunup, warn Sovereign John. Then we had best all go to sleep directly, said Herodsfoot. The stew eaten, everybody went to rest in the Wocho. The baby, peacefully replete with fruit juice, was already in a deep slumber, but Dido could not sleep. Hearing everyone else's quiet breathing only made her more wakeful. She slipped out of the Wocho and went to sit on the steps of the monument. Now it seemed to her, strangely enough, that she could hear a voice singing, not very loud, the kind of untroubled, quiet song that a person might sing almost under their breath while doing a job of work, picking berries or ironing or hemming a shirt. The song, now and then Dido could just about catch the words, was about how we came once from our old grandmother the sea, and were due to end up, bleached and desiccated, with our old grandfather the desert, and a long, strange journey it was between the two extremes. Oh, from swim to fly, from wet to dry, from fly to blow, blow in the window. It was a queer song, rather like the ones Yorka sang, thought Dido. But who could be the singer? Might it be Aunt Tala'a? Didn't Yorka say that she was to be found in this part of the island? The song was interrupted by an angry voice, and this voice was perfectly familiar to Dido. She had heard it quite recently and could not mistake. It was that of Manuel, harsh, nasal, and arrogant. Will you stop caterwauling and pay me some heed? Oh, why should I? Why should I? Because I love you. And a strange way you had of showing your love. Oh, Eretho, don't torment me. Say one kind thing to me. You found a witch to poison me, she sang. You threw my daughter in the sea. You plan ill luck for my poor king. Why should I say you one kind thing? You never loved John. I never loved either of you, but he was my husband, brought me up and was kind to me. You never raised me a moment. You were far away playing with dice and dominoes in Europe. Games. If you had the choice between me alive and a pair of never-lose dice, which would you take? Don't trouble to answer, I know. I love you, he shouted angrily. Easy words. Now my daughter's come back. Do you plan to throw her into the sea a second time? Or what is your plan? I have no plan. Where is she? Do you know where she is? I have no plan. Oh, come on. You first put the notion of coming back to Eritu in her head so that she could be useful to you, or you could dispose of her. You had her hustled into jail on a lame charge, so she would have to be obliged to you, but she got out. The clever thing, your trail is all over the landscape like a snail's slime. You cannot conceal it. I hate this island. I wish it were under the sea. If it were under the sea, you would not be able to come and scold me. Scolding a ghost was a dismal hobby. Or I hate this island. I wish it were under the sea. If it were under the sea, you would not be able to come and scold me. Scolding a ghost, what a dismal hobby. I love you. I love you. Oh, my dear Paul, enough. You had best find another watchword, for that one won't help you, and soon you are going to fall over the edge. What do you mean, edge? What edge? But there came no answer to that. The other voice began singing again. From wet to dry, from swim to fly, oh, the wind does blow. Ghosts talking, thought Dido. I didn't reckon when I came to Eritu that I'd be hearing ghosts talking. At least one of them was a ghost. Where was Manuel? Stretched on the steps of the monument, Dido fell asleep. And that's the end of chapter 9.